Hi, this is Bob Wells here, and welcome to Undercurrent Stories. This is the show where we hear about people's interests and uncover some fascinating stories at the same time. I hope you enjoy today's show. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Undercurrent Stories podcast. When I was at school in the mid-1970s, I remember a book lying around in the sixth form common room. It had a curious cover with a flower and a spanner merged together on a blue background. The book, entitled Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance by Robert Pirsig, had become a popular classic since its publication in 1974 and was an instant bestseller and has since become an American epic. Now, I'm not sure if any of us at school actually read the book in full, as we weren't sure what to make of it. Was it about motorcycle maintenance? Was it about Zen and Eastern mysticism and philosophy? Or was it the story just of a basic American road trip? Well, here to discuss the book and bring some clarity, I'm delighted to welcome Mark Richardson to the show. Mark is a journalist and author and former automotive editor of the Toronto Star. Among his books is a book entitled Zen and Now, which retraces Robert Pirsig's original road trip. Mark's book has been critically acclaimed as a good primer for would-be readers of Zen. Hello and welcome to the show, Mark.
Hey, Bob. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you on. Hey, I said that a bit about priming. Isn't priming something to do with motorbike engines as well?
Well, old motorbike engines, yeah. You have to kind of prime them, get the gas just ready, get everything all into sync so that it's going to be okay that when you give that big kick, it's going to start. My old bike is a kickstart motorcycle, but I don't think there's very many bikes with kickstarters left anymore.
No. I seem to remember my father talking about priming, but not anymore. Anyway, thanks for coming on the show. It's great to have you on. Before we talk about Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance, please could you just tell us a bit about your life's journey and how you became interested in Robert Pirsig and his book?
Sure. Well, I'm old now. I'm like 62, which means that this book, when it was published in 1974, was also sort of I was a teenager at that time, right? I was right around sixth form and everything else, and I was a teenager, and I saw the book on my aunt's bookshelf at home, and she hadn't read it. She'd been given it by somebody because it was such a popular book at the time. And it had a picture of a guy on it. It was a different one. It wasn't the one with the spanner and the lotus, or the wrench and the lotus, as we say over here in North America. It wasn't that one. It had a picture of a guy and his young son just sort of with a motorcycle looking out onto the horizon. I couldn't tell you what edition it was. But I thought it looked kind of cool because it had to be about motorcycles, right? And I was just getting into motorcycles. I got my first moped at 15. I got my bike at 16, and I liked bikes. And I stole this book from my aunt. She wasn't reading it. She didn't notice it was gone. I took it, and I started to read it, and it was great for about the first 20 pages or so. And then I guess kind of drifted off. And that was that. Because it's not really about motorcycles. It uses motorcycles as a tool to get into its essential stuff about philosophy. Anyway, you want to know about me because in the meantime, I was born in the UK, but then I emigrated with my parents to Canada at 18 years old after my A-levels. And I got a couple of jobs, did stuff. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. Had no idea what I was going to do. And I eventually, actually, when I was 23, I think I was, 23, 24, I took off on my motorcycle to just go and explore North America because we were living outside Toronto and I'd never really seen anything of North America. And I was curious. So I got on my old dirt bike, my Suzuki DR600, big thumper, and I set off for a year to explore America. I figured that would be very romantic. It wasn't actually very romantic. It was a bit hard going because I had no money. And I was just trying to work along the way.
Was it on your own, Mark, or did you go with anybody else?
Just me. Yeah. Just me, yeah. I set off. I had a mate who ended up living on the West Coast in California, and I met up with him at one point. But I traveled around, just sort of going places, and I really wanted to go up to the Arctic, and I wanted to go to Alaska, and I wanted to see this stuff. But at some point along the way, I was sitting with a couple of other people in a diner. I in America. I couldn't tell you where it was. I was probably 6 months on the road, and the waitress comes along and she says, what are you doing? Who are you? You've got out-of-state license plates. Why are you here? And I was about to say, well, I'm just a bum, because I was at the time. I was just riding around being a bum. I was going to say I'm just a bum. My other friend, who was a bit of a shyster, who I'd met up with, he said, oh, Mark is a British journalist, and he's over here researching a book about the American dream. And I thought, oh, that sounds cool. That sounds better than saying I'm a bum. So I started telling people I was a journalist. Yeah, I'm a journalist. Yeah, that's what I do. I'm a journalist. And I'd never actually written anything, except I'd written lots of letters home, because I got kind of lonely on the way and all of this. Anyway, at some point or another, somebody said, well, can I read something you've written? And I had nothing to show them because I wasn't a journalist. But I did end up writing an article for a motorcycle magazine in Canada, Cycle Canada magazine, about riding up to the Northwest Territories and Alaska and all of that, because I just thought that would be a cool story. And I sent it in, and they paid me $300. And I thought, wow, this is money for jam. I can do this. So I then promised my mother that I would apply to journalism school, because it was the only way I knew how to become a journalist. And I would apply to journalism school, and if I was accepted at journalism school, I promised her that I would stick it out for a year to see how it went. And I really was kind of hoping I wouldn't be accepted, because I wanted to go off and carry on around the world, to be honest with you. South America next, and then the world. It was all very romantic. And I did get accepted, and so in the September of the next year, I went to journalism school in Toronto. And then I just loved it and stuck through the whole course and became a journalist in the end. And I like to tell people that I was a real journalist. I did real journalism stuff. I got a job at a newspaper in Ottawa, and I ended up in Africa and all of this stuff. Anyway, to back up a little bit, somewhere along the way, I guess it was while I was at university learning to be a journalist, I did a course in philosophy. And I figured, I should read that philosophy book again. I'll get a lot more out of it this time. And I probably got 100 pages into Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And then I just drifted off, because I had no idea about Socrates and Aristotle and the ancient sophists and all of this. And Zen, of course, and Buddhism. And I was interested in other things, and I had to be a journalist and covering fires and deaths and stuff, wars. So I put the book aside. Anyway, to move forward 20-odd years, I was now a journalist. I had come to Toronto. I had decided that I didn't like covering wars and fires and deaths, and I had become the automotive editor at the newspaper. This was the Toronto Star newspaper. And so all I had to do was cover cars and motorbikes and trucks and cool stuff like that, which was a lot more fun. And went on a holiday at one point in the summertime. This would have been 2003. I went on holiday with my wife and kids. My kids would have been 4 and 5 years old, that sort of thing. We went to a cottage on a lake, and I needed a book to read. This was over my birthday, right? I was going to have my birthday at this cottage. We were gone for a week. I needed a book to read. And I'm looking up at the bookshelf, and I see Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And I think, you know what? Maybe I'll give that another try, because everybody says it's a great book. I have no idea why it's a great book, but it never clicked before, but maybe it'll work this time. And I took a couple other books as well, and went off on this vacation. Slung up my hammock beside the lake, Rice Lake in Ontario, at this cottage. Kicked back while my kids were on the little sandy beach, building sandcastles, and started reading Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And this time, when I got to the tricky bits, and when I say tricky bits, I mean all the deep philosophy and everything else, I just said, yeah, whatever. And I plowed through that. I skipped over that, and I got back to the road trippy bits, because Robert Pirsig is a beautiful, beautiful writer. His descriptions of the road are extraordinarily evocative. It puts you right there, and he writes in this folksy Midwest style that just captures you. And it's beautiful. This time, I made it all the way through the book. I didn't let the philosophy put me off or anything like that. Whatever. I made it all the way through the book. And when I got to the end, I thought to myself, oh, that's what he's writing about. Now I understand it. Because it's kind of a tricky read, because he writes as a narrator, but it's not actually Pirsig himself who is the narrator. And there is a second narrator who is this mysterious guy called Phaedrus. And you never quite know who Phaedrus is or anything. And a couple of times Phaedrus becomes the narrator, and you kind of need a context. So it's kind of like when you're reading, or even when you're watching something that's a bit deep, you get more out of it the second time around. Like I just finished watching House of the Dragon the second time around before the new House of the Dragon series started, because I like that stuff. And everything fell into place for me. Oh, that's who she was. Oh, that's why they did that. Oh, that makes so much sense. So it was the same thing with reading this book. So literally, I got to the end of the book. I realized that's who Phaedrus is, and that's where it's coming from. And I literally lay in my hammock, and I believe that this was on my birthday, my 41st birthday. And I flipped right to the first page again, and I just read the book. And this time I read all the philosophy. And it all made so much sense to me. And I thought, okay, now I got it. So at the end of that, I thought that it was a really good book. And I also thought it sounded like a really good road trip. I like road trips. I don't know if you noticed, with...
Yeah, on some of the research, I see that you've done quite a few.
I've done a fair number of road trips.
Yeah.
Big ones. And I thought this sounds like a great road trip. And one of the reasons it's a great road trip is because it goes off onto the road less traveled, right? Nobody really does this stuff in North Dakota and in Idaho and the like. And I thought that sounds like a great road trip. I should do that road trip. And not only that, but I should do this road trip so that I end up on my birthday in a year's time in San Francisco. The road trip goes from Minneapolis to San Francisco, and it takes about 2 weeks. And if I can end on my birthday in San Francisco, that'd be really cool. But don't forget I have a wife and 2 small children. And you don't just take off on a solitary motorcycle for 2 weeks on a road trip and say, well, bye, honey, I'll see you in a month. There's some negotiation. There's some organization that needs to be done. So I did tell my wife, I said, look, I haven't read anything else about Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. I believe there could be a book here that helps to explain this whole thing. And maybe if I do this road trip, then some of it might rub off on me. Some of its search for quality might sink in. And also I might be able to write a book about it. So that's why you should let me take off for a month or so, and I'll do this as a research project. And she said, okay. And so then it all fell into place, and I did that, and I made the journey and made it home in one piece as well, and it was good. That's a very long answer to your question. Sorry.
It's a very interesting answer. And as I say, for somebody like myself who was aware of the book when it came out, being a lad of the 70s, I even think my father had a copy somewhere, although I don't seem to remember it being read.
Probably.
It seemed to be in the bookcase, but it was a very popular book. So for the fact that it's endured for so long, 50 years and everything, and it's still selling, what do you think the main... We can talk about, a brief summary of the book in a minute, but what do you think the main appeal of the book is? Because, like I say, I mean, you had a couple of goes at it, and I know people who have got it and haven't read it. What do you think the appeal... 2 questions, really. What do you think the appeal of it is, and what do people get out of it once they've read it?
It's difficult to say what the initial appeal of it is. I would say that of the various people that I've spoken to who have read the book or who have owned the book, certainly a lot of motorcyclists, and I am a motorcyclist, and a lot of motorcyclists will buy this book. I would say probably 95% of people who have bought the book or had it given to them have not actually read it. I think that they've come to the same conclusion as me, that they make it a little bit in, and then they realize that it's not actually a road trip or anything, or it's centered around a road trip. It uses that as a framework. But the vast majority of people who have heard of the book or who have it have not made it all the way through because it is, or it can be, a tough read. It has a reputation, though, as a book that will help to point you in the right direction if you're looking to find quality. Quality is the word that is intrinsic throughout this book, that the author, Robert Pirsig, was looking for quality. What is quality? Quality, and to me, maybe to you too, quality is something that's pretty good. If it's got quality, then it's a good thing. This solid metal thing here is more quality than this plastic thing over here. That sort of stuff, right? And I'm sort of content with that. I think probably most people are. But for somebody like Robert Pirsig, who was a much deeper thinker and who was literally a tortured genius, it's much more than that. What is quality? And so the whole book is about that. And I'm sorry, you had two parts of the question. The one was that why do people get into it?
Yeah, and what do you think?
The reason.
Yeah, and the other one really was once they've successfully read it and I've studied it and understood it. What do you think they get out of it?
I think everybody gets something a little different out of it, to be honest with you. And people have done PhDs on this stuff. The thing is that you can tell even by the name of the book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. It is about, at its core, it is a blend of old and new, East and West, right? Zen is Eastern spirituality. Art is the romantic the romantic side of life, I guess. The sort of still with a little bit with spiritual, but then you get to the motorcycle maintenance, which is the practical side of stuff. And in philosophy, that's the ancient Greeks. And so Robert Pirsig, who was a student of rhetoric and a student of philosophy, a teacher of it, to be honest with you, he finds the blend between the practicality of the ancient Greeks and the spirituality of the Eastern Buddhists and Zen practitioners, and finds the way that they blend together to try and make something the best it can be. And ultimately, as I think I've said, if you want to blend it or push it all down into one sentence, it says that if a job is worth doing, it's worth doing well.
Yeah.
And that you should take the time to do something and not allow yourself to be distracted. And this is the curious thing about this, right? Because this book was written in the road trip that he made, it's a real road trip. The road trip that he made with his 11-year-old son, Chris, was in 1968. It took him 6 years, various manuscripts, to write the book. It comes out in 1974. And one of the big lessons that it has is don't allow yourself to be so distracted by the many distractions of modern life. And you consider the difference between distractions of modern life in 1974 compared to today. There was no social media. There was really no internet. There was nothing like that, right? I think that it's a lesson that is that's far more relevant today than it ever was before.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because obviously Pirsig embraced technology in terms of the motorcycle and fixing it and everything. What do you think he'd be like today with social media and AI and all this sort of thing? Do you think he'd embrace it?
He died I'm trying to remember when he died. I think it was longer. I think it died in 2017.
Yeah.
He lived a long and industrious life. He was actually ahead of his time in many ways with technology. He was very good with technology. He understood computers before anybody else did. He used to write technical manuals for rocket boosters and stuff.
Oh, right.
One of the many jobs that he did.
Yeah.
He was very, very good with this sort of stuff. As far as social media is concerned, though, he would have hated it, totally hated it. I mean, Facebook existed while Robert Pirsig was still alive, and he sort of dabbled his toes in it, but he was a reclusive guy. His book was such an immediate hit that it took him completely unawares. And although he really liked the the acceptance of his beliefs and his thought, which he'd been just sort of yelling at the wall up until 1974, suddenly he became this popular guy. He liked that, but he really hated the idea that people would just stop in and see him, that they would recognize him on the street sometimes. And he became very reclusive. I did make contact with him. I've never met the guy, but I did ask to meet him, and he declined me very, very politely and nicely. He said, I won't meet with you because the best place to meet an author is on the pages of his book. Anything else is a disappointment, believe me, he said to me, or he wrote to me. But we did exchange letters. He told me at one point that his intention was to become the second most reclusive author in North America, presumably after J.D. Salinger. And he lived a quiet life with his second wife in Maine, in New England, and he didn't want people to know where he lived. So I actually made a deal with him. I just agreed with him that I would never publish anything in my book that helped anybody to find him. Though it, frankly, wasn't very difficult to find him if you wanted to do so, if you really did want to do so. But he liked talking with people about his philosophy. He loved to explain it to people who were curious about it. But the rest of it, he really wasn't all that bothered about.
Just talking about the trip that you did again, did you go on exactly the same route that he took?
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
And I was lucky that when I did it in 2004, which was the 30th anniversary of the publication of the book, published in 1974. And that's why actually it's a reasonably big deal among all the Pirsigians, if you want to call them that, this year, because this is the 50th anniversary of the publication of the book. There's actually a gathering happening in a couple of weeks' time or so, in early July, in Minneapolis, at the Zen Center, and I'm going to be there. And then some people are making the same trip all the way out west to San Francisco. But when I did it, I took my old motorcycle. I figured that I should take my old bike because he rode an old bike, a small underpowered Honda Superhawk CB77, made like 23 horsepower or something. I took my old bike. I went to Minneapolis. I found the home that he had lived in, where he'd written the book. I found some of the people who were still involved with the book, who were still alive at that time, but who since passed away. When he made the road trip, it was him and Chris on their Honda, and it was his friends, John Sutherland and his wife Sylvia, on their BMW. And the friends and Pirsig rode together to Bozeman, Montana, across the prairie, across North Dakota, a little bit of South Dakota, through Montana and Wyoming. And they got to Bozeman, where Pirsig had taught for a while at Montana State College. And he taught rhetoric there. And they had some friends, or he had some friends. Pirsig had these friends who lived outside of Bozeman. And they stayed there for a few days. And the original friends, the Sutherlands, went back home again at that point. And Pirsig and his son carried on west. So I was lucky enough to meet up with John Sutherland, who showed me around and told me about how the trip had been. And I was lucky enough to meet with Jenny DeWeese, who was the host in Bozeman, who had put him up for a few days. And I actually stayed at her place and had dinner with them and hung out there for a little bit. And then I carried on my own through Idaho and Oregon all the way out to the West Coast and tried as best I could to follow the exact route. In the book, when you read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, in the book itself, Pirsig is very, very, very descriptive of the road, as I mentioned. He names some of the towns that he goes through, but it's not a travelogue, not by any means. And there are plenty of places where you don't know where he went next. You know some of the destinations, but not all of them. So I had to figure out what the correct route would be to follow the exact route.
So you had to be quite creative when you were looking at your map, I guess.
I did and I didn't, because what I hadn't realized when I sort of set out to do this was that other people had done this before me. In fact, they started doing this ever since 1974, just quietly making the trip or making parts of the trip or just riding it for a day or so, just because it was a road trip, I guess. And those people actually have names. They're called Pirsig Pilgrims.
Pirsig Pilgrims.
The same route.
Oh, right.
Pirsig Pilgrims are following the same route as Pirsig. Not necessarily even headed west. They might be heading east, just doing it backwards or whatever. And some of them do the exact route. Some of them do the same number of days. Others just do a little bit for a while and see how it works. And they take the book along with them, and they read those sections of the book when they're at these places and the like. And I became a Pirsig pilgrim, I guess, doing it as best I could in the exact same time frame, staying at the same places as he did, roughly. And the cool thing about it, and it's still the cool thing about it, is because this really is the road less traveled. People don't usually take these roads through Idaho and the Dakotas and the like. A lot of it really hasn't changed very much. A lot of it is still pretty much the same. And when Pirsig says there's a tree, there's a tree.
What is the scenery like?
I mean, I think everything is dramatic in its own way. I mean, it starts out in Minnesota and goes right across the prairie, which is just flat, obviously.
Yeah.
But when you get into Montana, and then becomes Badlands, and that's cool. You get to Montana, and you're battling into a headwind, especially which you notice when you're on a motorcycle, I can tell you, especially an underpowered old thumper like mine. But you get to the mountains finally. You get to the mountains actually at near Laurel, Montana, I guess it is, and you go up the Beartooth Pass. And the Beartooth Pass is one of these roads that were built in the Depression to just create work. And they cost $1 million every mile. And it really shouldn't exist. It just goes up the side of the mountain and goes up to about 10,000 feet. And it's stunningly beautiful. Few people take it. It's off the beaten path, right?
Yeah.
But it's one of those roads that you must drive or ride before you die. So you get to the top of the Beartooth Pass where there's probably snow, and then you make your way across to Yellowstone, and then you get back into Montana, and then you're back into the mountains again. In Idaho, you start out, I think, on the Lolo Pass, and the Lolo Pass has this famous sign. It says, "Winding road for 100 miles." And it's just winding, and it's a gorgeous road that follows the river, follows the canyon through, all the way through Idaho, and then you get to Oregon, and then things open up again, and then finally, of course, and this is all very literary as well, right? For metaphors and everything else, you get to the Pacific Ocean, and you get to the coast, and in the book, there's this sort of literary showdown that happens. The climax of the book happens somewhere south of Eureka, north of San Francisco, where the narrator and this mysterious character, Phaedrus, have it out at the side of the road next to the ocean. And then the book just settles into place from there.
With your book, were you actually thinking about what you'd be writing it as you travelled? Did you make it more of a travelogue than Pirsig?
No, I took lots of notes. What I did actually was I took audio notes. I had a camera, and these days you don't even think about this with smartphones, right? But I took a camera which I could record little audio notes with pictures, and so I would take a photograph, and then I'd just sort of talk into the camera and say, clouds scudding across the horizon or whatever, so I could remember this. Pirsig himself had an amazing memory for this sort of stuff. I talked to John Sutherland about it, and he said that he never saw him writing down notes or anything like that. But what he did report on, what he did write about, was very true to what had actually happened for that sort of travelogue side of it. So I went into this like I go into most things. I took lots of notes for myself in my head. I tried to remember as much as I could, but I had no idea what the outcome was really going to be.
Yeah.
So I just took everything day by day. I didn't set out with any preconceptions. I just wanted to see what might and would happen. And it worked out well for me that way, I must admit. And I got to San Francisco on my 42nd birthday. It was all very cool.
I think Pirsig camped, didn't he, most nights on his route?
Yeah, he camped almost every night. Yeah, he was a lot more rugged than me. I only camped one night.
So you pre-booked places that you were staying at, did you?
No, I found places to stay as I went. Yeah, I didn't pre-book anything other than, I guess, when I started out in Minneapolis. I had contacted John Sutherland and I'd contacted Jenny DeWeese before I left, but that was about it.
Yeah,
and I knew that I would visit them on these days, and the rest of it I was just open to finding out what was going to happen.
I guess when you're traveling those distances, if you're doing 100, I don't know how many miles you do a day, but let's say you did 120 miles a day, it gives you a lot of time to think, doesn't it, with a long straight or a long windy road ahead of you. Did you sort of have any of those philosophical thoughts that would have been going through Pirsig's head as you were actually traveling?
I can't say that my thoughts would have been the same as Pirsig's. No. I don't think the two of us thought the same way about anything in particular. But that is one of the beauties for me about riding a motorcycle. A lot of people these days especially ride with earphones and they listen to music and they listen to podcasts and everything else. They are not used to the idea of not having some sort of oral stimulation. I always listen to stuff when I'm in a car. When I'm on a motorcycle, I have a rule to not do so. I have headphones in my, or little speakers in my helmet. I have headphones that I can plug into my phone and everything else. I can listen to music and podcasts if I want to, but I don't. I like to just, I've always been this way. And I've traveled hundreds of miles. I've traveled 1,000 miles in a day before now with no external stimulation coming into my brain, as it were, right? Yeah. I just, it's time to think. And that's one of the things.
Yeah. Did you say 1,000 miles in a day?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I've done that a couple of stupid things to do. There's a whole club here. There's a club called it's not a club, association, the Iron Butt Association. You join the Iron Butt Association, you get your gas things at the beginning, your gas things at the end, and you got to do 1,000 miles in 24 hours. Prove yourself. Yeah. Some people do more than that. They go off and do the Iron Butt run, and they do 11,000 miles in 11 days. Yeah. It's nuts.
I mentioned that your book had been critically acclaimed as a sort of primer for Pirsig's book, particularly for people who want to get into it. What does your book give, would you say?
So my book is about three different things. Everything's written on different levels. Pirsig's book is written on different levels. My book has three different stories going on in it. My book has the story of my own road trip, which is the story that I always thought that Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance was going to be about. And I figured, you know what? Motorcyclists want to read about road trips. This is why 95% of people never read the original book. They wanted a road trip. So I'll just write a story about a road trip. But I also wrote the story about Robert Pirsig himself, because the guy was fascinating. And nobody knew anything about him because he was reclusive and he didn't want to talk. And he had given lots of interviews to journalists in the past, but very, very controlled. There was only so much information out there. So I ended up writing his biography, kind of mini biography about him. And also the third part of my book is my own sort of traveling and what I got out of the whole road trip. Because at the time, I'm quite honest about this. I mean, I was the father of young children. My life was stressful. I wasn't sure that I was in the best place. I just wanted to get away for a while. I just wanted to get the hell out and see if the grass was greener on the other side. I wasn't looking to get out of my marriage. I was just looking to get a break, because when as a father of young children, it's 24/7, right? And I wasn't used to this. And I just needed a break from it. And I just wanted to take a long road trip and go off and see what it was like at the other end and reassess it.
So some self-therapy.
Exactly, Bob. Yeah, that'll do it. The thing is, when I came back, I sat down and I wrote the book. And I wrote it as a travelogue. And I wrote it as, this is what happened to me. And I wrote as much as I knew about Robert Pirsig. And I had an agent. And my agent sent it off to publishers. And I heard nothing. Absolutely nothing. It was crushing. I'd written this book. I thought it was brilliant. And Nobody was interested. Nobody was interested. And then the agent ditched me. She said, nobody wants it. Part of the issue, apparently, according to the agent at the time, was I was Canadian. Not even that, I was Canadian with a British accent. And I was doing the American ride. So it should be done by Americans. I was told that Canadian publishers didn't care because it was about an American road trip. American publishers didn't care because I was Canadian. So nobody was interested. Plus, they didn't like the book anyway. Oh. And I would send the book out to people, and I'd give it to all my friends, my family, with the manuscript anyway. And I'd say, what do you think of this book? And all my family would say, oh, it's a lovely book. It's really nice. You missed an apostrophe on page 57, that sort of thing, right? But everybody said it's kind of missing something. Don't know what it's missing, but it's missing something. I hope you find it. Which was no damn help to me whatsoever, because I had no idea what it was missing. I thought I'd written a work of brilliance. So in the end, I was crushed by this. I was crushed by having written a book that nobody cared about and nobody was interested in. So I thought, well, you know what? Maybe my book isn't as brilliant as I think it is, and I need a bit of space from it. I just need to get it out of my head and reassess it. So I guess I'd read somewhere this was a good thing to do. I took my book, my manuscript, and I literally put it on a shelf for a calendar year. I promised myself, don't even think about it, don't look at it, put it on the shelf. I put it on the shelf on December 31st of whatever year it was. I said, I'm not going to look at it again until January 1st in a year's time. Meanwhile, I'll get on with the rest of my life. So I did that. And somewhere around the summertime, I was chatting with a friend of mine who was a motorcycle journalist, quite a cerebral guy, who had just been fired from his job. In fact, this was the editor who had first commissioned that story from me about riding off up to the Northwest Territories all those years ago. And he said to me, hey, Mark, how's that book going of yours? And I said, oh, don't talk to me about that damn book. It's not doing anything. And he said, oh, that's too bad. But he was a smart guy, and he had actually read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And he'd just been fired, as I said. So I thought, his name was Bruce Reeve. And I said, Bruce, tell you what, can I give you a copy of my manuscript? And can I pay you money so that you have to tell me something about it? Because everybody else, I give them the copy of the manuscript, and they say, oh, yeah, well, it's fine, yeah. I want a proper critique of it. Would you do that for me? Because you've got some time on your hands now, mate. Sorry, but you do. I'll give you $200. I'll give you the manuscript, and just give me 1 page or 2 pages. Just tell me something about it, what you think of it. Because this guy was actually a frustrated literary editor. He wanted to be a books editor, and ended up in motorcycles. And he said, sure, I'll do that. So I gave him the book. This would have been August or so, I guess. I gave him the manuscript. He read it, and he sent me back 2 pages. And he said, Mark, I've read your book. It's a nice book. It reads well. It's nice, etc. But you're missing something. And this is what you're missing. He said,
right.
You're not telling me anything about this Robert Pirsig guy. He's this kooky guy. This Robert Pirsig was committed to an insane asylum at one point because, and given electroshock therapy because the man was insane. And then he comes out of all of that and writes this great book. He said, I want to know about that. This is what I just told you just now is about as much as I had written in my original book. And Bruce said, I want to know more about that. Tell me about this guy. Also, he said, I want you to tell me about the book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. I want you to tell me why I should want to read it. Don't just tell me about how you felt about it. Tell me about the book itself. And I thought to myself, well, great. Thank you, Bruce. Here's your $200. Thank you. This is of no help to me whatsoever because the guy is reclusive. He doesn't talk to anybody. I can't find out anymore. That's as much as I know, and nobody's going to find it out. Plus, an analysis of the metaphysics of quality. This takes a PhD. I can't, I can't, I'm not that smart. I can't do that. I had actually sent the book to Robert Pirsig, the manuscript to him. He had read it. And he had read it and kindly wrote back and said, well, it's fine. He said, it's kind of strange because he said, I felt when I read it like a ghost at my own funeral, having these people talking about me and the like.
Yeah.
But he said, I think it's missing something. And he said, I think what it's missing is a proper analysis of Zen. And I think that what you should do is you should take some time to study Zen. Maybe sort of put yourself into a monastery for a while. And I thought, oh my God, I can't. I just
this thing's grown legs, you thought.
Yeah, talk about legs. So anyway, I'm feeling particularly crushed after all of this and after Bruce's thing. And I thought, well, I guess the book's not going to happen. But then I had a few months before looking at the book again. And I did a bit more chipping away, just as I could, to see just what else I could possibly find out about Robert Pirsig. And I found some more pilgrims, and I found some more information, and eventually I found his ex-wife, the woman he had been married to at the time, and I found his estranged son. This is not the same son that was on the motorcycle.
Chris was the first one, wasn't he?
Chris was on the motorcycle with him. And the trouble with that is, Chris was murdered when he was 22 years old, or just about to turn 22 years old, in San Francisco. Chris didn't exist anymore. But he had a second son called Ted, his younger son. Ted wanted nothing to do with Robert Pirsig for various reasons. And I found him, he's now living in Hawaii. I actually found him in Switzerland, but I'm a journalist, right? I was trained as a journalist to do this stuff. I sort of knew how to find it, chip away, and never quite gave up. So when I found all this extra information, I could fill in some blanks. And then I read Zen and the Art a number more times, and I filled in the whole thing that sort of explained the book, and I turned it into more of a primer for reading the book itself. And it also became a much more interesting biography of this guy. And when I produced that, then I sent it to another agent who had said to me, well, I hope that you find what you're missing. And I said, I think I found what I'm missing. Would you read this manuscript? And she did. And everything then was a big flurry of activity, and it was published 6 months later by Knopf.
Yeah, looking forward to reading that. Just a quick question on your writing process. If we've got any listeners that feel they would like to do some writing, whether that's memoirs or because you've done some fiction as well, haven't you?
I've written a couple of novels. I've self-published my novels. I just wanted to know if I could write a novel or not. So I wrote a novel. I published it. I put it out there for criticism. People loved it. I got very good criticism back, so I've written another novel. I enjoy writing novels. I find it very therapeutic. The kind of novels I write are sort of thriller type mystery novels, right? And it's a fascinating intellectual exercise in that you're trying to fit all these jigsaw puzzle bits together. And I really enjoy doing that. But I also do nonfiction as well. I have a new book coming out soon.
If we've got any listeners that feel they'd like to do some writing, what advice would you give them?
Sit down and start writing. Geez, that's the first thing. Just sit down and start writing. And if you've got writer's block, then just write about what you can see. And just because it happens, and almost certainly whatever you start writing is not going to end up in the finished product. But you can go back. When you've got some words on the page, you can go back and fix them. If you've got no words on the page, or if you're just sort of sitting outside drinking a beer and not writing, well, that's not getting a book written. The only thing you can do is write.
And with your novels, do you plot them first? Do you sort of know how it's going to end, or do they develop as you travel?
Well, apparently there are two different kinds of novel writers. There are pantsers, which is doing it by the seat of the pants, and there are plotters, where you plot everything out beforehand. And I plot the beginning and the end, and the middle sort of finds its way. And in fact, I with writing a novel, and I find it's lovely to write a novel because you can just make it up to make it all fit, right? You don't have to go off and research lots of stuff. It depends on the kind of novel you do. But I find that I can be writing a novel, and I'm writing a page, and then something just suddenly falls into place, and you just give this guy a wife or a child or something, and You had no idea when you began that page that that was going to happen, and it just happens in the writing process, and then it all makes sense.
Yeah,
and that's that. It's like a huge sort of light comes on, and everything else. It's extremely rewarding.
Do you have any more road trips planned?
I've just finished a monster road trip, which is crossing Canada, which I actually did this last year. I've done it before. I did it in 2012 because I am actually the exact same age as the Trans-Canada Highway. The Trans-Canada Highway was open on the day that I was born. And I was born in Langley, Buckinghamshire, at number 17 Market Lane. And at 8 o'clock in the evening and at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the Premier of British Columbia snipped the ribbon to open the Trans-Canada Highway. And then they all went off and had tea and everything else. So when I discovered I was the exact same age as the Trans-Canada Highway, I figured, well, I should drive the Trans-Canada Highway and do something about it. So I did this in 2012 when the highway turned 50 years old. I always had assumed it was there for hundreds of years, but no, it's not that old. And I wrote a blog about it at the time. I'd left my job at the Toronto Star, partly to get the time to do this road trip. And I drove from St. John's, Newfoundland, all the way to Victoria, British Columbia, which is it's about 8,000 kilometers if you do it directly. But I did this trip, and I wrote a blog about it for a Canadian magazine, acclaimed magazine at the time. And then I published that blog as a book the following year because I already had it, and it was easy to publish. What I had always wanted to do was write the sort of full story about the Trans-Canada Highway, how it came to be. And what I hadn't realized, I came to realize when I did this original trip in 2012, was that the very first person to ever drive across the country, Canada, to try to do it, was exactly 100 years previously, in 1912. And it was an English journalist called Thomas Wilby. And it's a fascinating story because Thomas Wilby had a chauffeur who was not really a chauffeur. He was the head mechanic for the car company that had given him a free car, the Rio Car Company. And Wilby was a snob, and he hated the chauffeur, and the chauffeur hated him, and they barely talked on the whole trip across the country. And it's a fascinating story. Anyway,
yeah,
there were all these various guys who tried to drive across Canada. There was a gold medal to be won for the first person who did it. And they never quite did it. Nobody crossed the country until 1946. Anyway, I just did it again last year because I found I had the time and the inclination to do this. And this time I've actually sat down and written the book about the Trans-Canada Highway. And it'll be published next summer.
And does it include the story of what happened 100 years ago as well?
The book is called The Drive Across Canada, The Remarkable Story of the Trans-Canada Highway and Its Adventurous Pathfinders. And it tells the story of Wilby and Haney back then, and Dr. Doolittle. It tells the story of the first guy to actually make it across the country was a motorcyclist from the Isle of Man, a guy called Graham Oates, who did it by taking railroad tracks and riding his motorcycle on the railroad tracks, bumpity, bumpity, bump, when he had to, because the trouble was the roads weren't built, right?
No.
And there's these two sections. One is in the mountains of British Columbia. The other's in the swampland and forest of northern Ontario. And there was no way to get across unless you took the railway, bumpity, bumpity, bump, which is how that guy did in 1928.
Mark, why do you think, going back to Pirsig himself, why do you think he wrote the book in the first place?
Well, he says that what he wanted to do was to he originally did it as an essay for his friend John Sutherland, the guy that was on the BMW that traveled with him. He just wanted to try and do a relatively concise, few thousand words story that matched East and West thought, because the two of them were interested in philosophy, and I think that Pirsig just wanted to be able to put it all down into words. And he originally wrote It was started out as an essay, and then it ended up being like this 200,000 word manuscript that didn't even have the motorcycle road trip in it. And there's a famous story that it was in the Guinness Book of Records that Robert Pirsig was the most rejected author of all time. He sent out 127 or 137, 127 pitches at publishers, of which only one accepted the pitch.
Wow.
And that was a guy called Jim Landis in New York City who was intrigued by it. The actual story is that he just sent out mimeographed letters, pitches to 127 or whatever it was, publishers, and there were 6 of them that actually expressed an interest. But the only one who stuck with him all the way through was Jim Landis. And it took 6 years of writing, and then he included the whole thing about the motorcycle road trip, and then he included the whole thing about Phaedrus. Phaedrus was the character. He created this character in which, while he's narrating the story of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance and trying to talk to the reader about this is the way you think about this and this and this, and this is what he saw along the way, there's this character, Phaedrus, who keeps popping back into his memory. He has fragments of memory that remind him of something that Phaedrus had done. Phaedrus was the guy that was him before the electroshock therapy.
Oh, so it was him.
The idea was that, yes, right. Phaedrus is the same person.
Yeah.
But the idea is that the electroshock therapy erased his entire memory of everything that happened before then. Mm. And it's a very, very effective tool. In truth, he actually remembered everything. Robert Pirsig, the person, remembered everything just fine. It didn't erase his memory at all.
Oh, right.
But it's a very, very literary thing and very effective tool to be able to have these flashbacks suddenly that literally come at the beginning of the book. It literally comes with a bolt of lightning when he remembers, I've been here before. I've ridden on this road before. So it took him 6 years to write the book. It practically killed him to do so. He had to find the time to do it. He was getting up at 2 in the morning. He was going to bed early, getting up at 2 in the morning, going to this little rented office down in Minneapolis and pounding away for 8 hours. And then he'd go off to his regular job. And then he'd come home to the wife and kids and everything else at the end of that. Mm. But it all worked out for him in the end, but it took a long time to get there.
Yeah. It's been a fantastic conversation, Mark. Where can people find out more about your work and where can they get hold of the book?
Well, I have my own website, markrichardson.ca. .ca is the Canadian extension. You can. The book is not generally available in the UK, I don't believe. It was never published in the UK. It was only published in Canada, North America, and US. You can certainly get it if you go into North American websites. And I've got all the links on my page for how to find it there. And you can get it as an audio book, and you can get it as a digital book and everything else, so the printed edition too. But you probably have to pretend you're Canadian to do so now, or American.
Well, it's been a really fascinating conversation, Mark. You've answered a lot of questions about the book, and I found it very helpful to get a deeper, sort of broader understanding of what it's about and also how to approach reading it. My guest today has been Mark Richardson. Mark is a journalist and author and former automotive editor of the Toronto Star, and you can find a link to Mark's book, Zen and Now, and a link to his website on the show notes. Thank you for coming on the show, Mark.
It's been a pleasure, Bob. Thanks for having me.
You have been listening to Undercurrent Stories. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please feel free to share the show link to your friends and family, and if you have 60 seconds, I will be most grateful if you would please rate and review. To hear more episodes, please subscribe to the show and visit undercurrentstories.com. If you leave your email in the link, we will notify you as soon as new episodes are released. Also, check out our social media links, details of which can be found on the show notes. Until next time, this is Bob Wells wishing you all the very best.